Today, the same grand jury that Jack Smith used to indict Trump last month met again in D.C. today. It was the first time in 4 weeks that these jury members have been spotted there. And the question I would very much like to know the answer to, is what and who could that all be about? Joining me now to discuss all this is Barbara McQuade, former U.S. Attorney for the Eastern District of Michigan, and David Aaron, former prosecutor in the DOJ's National Security Division and a former Manhattan Assistant District Attorney. Thank you both for being here. Dave, the special grand jury the grand jury convened for Jack Smith is set to expire on September 15th. Is that a real deadline? What does that indicate to you about the urgency with which the special counsel may be investigating?
I think the special counsel can extend that grand jury or ask for it to be extended and won't hesitate to do so if that's what's going to be best for the case. Certainly, I think he's moving with all deliberate speed, perhaps to add additional defendants, perhaps to add additional charges.
Yeah, we had some reporting from CNN that I'll quote. Smith is now focusing on how money raised off baseless claims of voter fraud was used to fund attempts to breach voting equipment in several states won by Biden, according to multiple sources. In both interviews, prosecutors have focused their questions on the role of former Trump lawyer Sidney Powell. That suggests a new avenue of investigation, not necessarily sort of tying with a bow the case against the unnamed co-conspirators, right? Is that right?
It adds a couple dimensions, one of which is financial, which is really important to add to this case, is to show that there was money involved rather than ideology. And I think it even expands the scope or the notion of who the victims are. The victims are the people who gave the money.
Right.
And then, of course, there is the question of what was that money used for? And does that tie the fundraising, the alleged fundraising scam to additional criminal activity? So it is an interesting through line.
Barb, I think there are a lot of people who wonder, well, what about the unnamed co-conspirators? That's still not complete. We don't have the list of those 6 names. Is your expectation that we're not going to, there are going to be no charging indictments on those folks until after Trump goes to trial on this?
I think that seems right, Alex. It seems like the strategy that Jack Smith is using here is to keep everything focused on Donald Trump for now in this case so that he can maximize the likelihood that this case can go to trial before the election. You've got a 5-year statute of limitations, and with these events occurring in 2021, that means they've got till 2026 before they have to complete the investigation to file charges on these others. And frankly, they can wait. The most important thing now is to get a conviction of Donald Trump so that the voters have that information before the election. I'd say the same is likely true with regard to this new avenue investigation that we're just talking about the money and fundraising off of these false claims. That could be charged in a separate indictment. It could be a superseding indictment in this already pending case, in the January 6th case. But it seems to me if Jack Smith's strategy is to get that case to trial as quickly as possible, he'd be better off charging the fundraising allegations in a separate indictment.
Is it considered, Barb, untoward or somehow sort of gaming the system to wait to charge those co-conspirators if Smith effectively, essentially already knows what he might charge them with, just in the name of expediting the trial of Donald Trump?
It's a very good question, Alex, and the Supreme Court answered that question in the United States versus Lavasco. It's a case I teach in my criminal procedure case, which is why it is at the tip of my tongue.
I'm going to TV law school, Barb. I'm learning and I'm taking notes. Proceed,
learning
please.
Very well. And it's perfectly permissible. As long as the case is charged within the statute of limitations, the government can continue to collect evidence. It is not required to charge just as soon as it has probable cause. It can continue to investigate, and the only deadline is the statute of limitations.
Having said that, I mean, if you're a defendant, Dave, and you're watching the grand jury reconvene, you know that the axe hangs above your head. Your name is perhaps Rudy Giuliani, and you're out there effectively, making infomercials for MyPillow slippers to raise funds. You have candlelight dinners that are being hosted. If you're Donald Trump, and you're just for a moment, right, if you will, is the reason Donald Trump hosting is the reason he's doing these kind of candlelight dinners and making such an effort to raise money for a person that is a key player in these investigations, if not these actual trials? Could that have to do with some behind-the-scenes wrangling to make sure that Rudy Giuliani stays loyal?
I think it's important to watch who gets their defense funded and who doesn't. And that's going to tell you a lot. Everyone always talks about follow the money, and that's as true here as it is anywhere else. Why raise money for him and not for the defense of others, if that is what's going on?
So that is your very prosecutorial answer, that perhaps there is something happening there that would suggest Donald Trump has I mean, Barb, from your outside assessment here, the notion that Donald Trump doesn't hold a candlelight dinner for just anybody and that he's doing this for Rudy Giuliani, I guess, should we draw inferences from that?
Well, you know, you can certainly speculate that he is trying to curry favor with Rudy Giuliani, keep him in his good graces. You know, it goes back to some of those things. Remember that we heard statements that they were making to Michael Cohen about, remember, you've got friends in high places. It sounds an awful lot like that. But I think anything short of a very overt example of tampering with a witness is not likely to rise to the level of criminal charges for obstruction of justice. You can see that sometimes if you're trying to persuade a person to testify in a certain way. I think simply holding a fundraiser for him, as rare as it may be, is probably not enough for criminal charges.
I do wonder, when we talk about the special counsel and what he's been up to this week, Dave, we know that in a filing this week, Jack Smith's team pointed to what they call, quote, Trump's daily extrajudicial statements that threaten to prejudice the jury in this particular case in and around January 6th in the 2020 election. He's filed a motion under seal that pertains to those extrajudicial statements. We know that Trump has been targeting Jack Smith online. What's the point of filing this under seal if these are public extrajudicial statements? And how do you read the sort of news of this?
So assuming that the filing is about those extrajudicial statements, there's something else in that motion that is non-public. And it could be someone's address. It could be personal details of someone who's been targeted, if it is indeed about those statements. So, you know, the process that's followed is the main filing is done under seal, and then a redacted version can be made public. So we don't know how much of that filing would have to be redacted. We don't know if it's one line or most of the filing that is causing it to be filed under seal. So it's really hard to tell. And this is just one of those frustrating things about watching a criminal case unfold from the outside.
Yeah, well, and following every procedural move. But I would ask you, if presumably this has to do with the statements Trump is making publicly and the fact that they are having an impact on the case already before they're even at trial. And I wonder if you think we are fast approaching the threshold at which the judge is going to have to do something here.
That day may come. I can see why the judge wouldn't want to do that unless it was absolutely necessary. And at what point do you decide it's gone too far?
Yeah.
Because the impact of that in many different ways is going to be enormous if that hammer does drop.
Barb, do you feel like, I mean, this is just a stress test for our entire judicial system, and I wonder how optimistic you are about our, the system's ability to keep someone like Donald Trump in check.
It's really tricky because he's running for president. I think if we didn't have that complicating factor, the judge would be much quicker to impose a gag order and say you can't say these kinds of things. But because he is running for president, I think that you're looking at the rights of the voters to have fulsome information. And if he says things like, I need to be able to defend myself publicly, and part of that is pointing out what I believe to be, the corrupt motives of the prosecutor and the judge. And so it makes it difficult for them to muzzle him as much as they might like. But I do think that, as Dave said, there is a point at which a judge has a responsibility to protect the integrity of the process and the witnesses and the prosecutor and the judge themselves by gagging some of these statements.
Well, and it seems like the Department of Justice is not messing around here. Barbara McQuade and David Aaron, thank you both for your time and expertise today. I appreciate it.
Thank you.